Good evening and welcome to the DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 16th of June 2026. I am Leela, bringing you today's key updates from the debt markets. Let us begin with the top 5 highest yield listed corporate bonds. Goswami Infratech Private Limited recorded a yield of 186.334% with a trade value of 20,033.98 lakh rupees. Unifins Capital India Limited recorded a yield of 17.25% with a trade value of 80 lakh rupees. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.90% with a trade value of 200 lakh rupees. Regency FinCorp Limited recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 30 lakh rupees. Akara Capital Advisors Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.40% with a trade value of 10 lakh rupees. Moving to the top 5 highest yield unlisted corporate bonds. Porteous Investment Private Limited recorded a yield of 19.7738% with a trade value of 4,100 lakh rupees. True Credits Private Limited recorded a yield of 15.50% with a trade value of 26 lakh rupees. Ma Kudargari Minerals and Refractories Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.50% with a trade value of 1,500 lakh rupees. Steamhouse India Limited recorded a yield of 14.23% with a trade value of 1,000 lakh rupees. Bhumika Shopping Centre India Private Limited recorded a yield of 14.00% with a trade value of 100 lakh rupees. Now, the mutual fund debt transactions. Gross purchases stood at 34,275.16 crore rupees. Gross sales stood at 41,561.54 crore rupees. Net investment stood at negative 7,286.38 crore rupees. Net investment for June, month to date, stood at negative 70,035.160 crore rupees. Turning to FPI debt market investments. Gross purchases under the general limit stood at 1,292.50 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, purchases stood at 1,161.10 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, purchases stood at 2,302.91 crore rupees. Gross sales under the general limit stood at 538.92 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, sales stood at 814.61 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, sales stood at 895.41 crore rupees. Net investment under the general limit stood at 753.58 crore rupees. Under the voluntary retention route, net investment stood at 346.49 crore rupees. Under the fully accessible route, net investment stood at 1,407.50 crore rupees. Month-to-date net investment for June stood at 4,598.38 crore rupees under the general limit, 3,569.58 crore rupees under the voluntary retention route, and 17,034.83 crore rupees under the fully accessible route. Calendar year 2026 year-to-date net investment stood at 1,203 crore rupees under the general limit, 618 crore rupees under the voluntary retention route, and 31,648 crore rupees under the fully accessible route. Moving to money market rates. Call rate stood at 5.36%. Tri-party repo stood at 5.30%. Basket repo stood at 5.33%. Special repo stood at 5.16%. Now for India government bond yields. 1-year yield stood at 5.87%. 3-year yield stood at 6.25%. 5-year yield stood at 6.45%. 7-year yield stood at 6.74%. 9-year yield stood at 6.88%. 10-year yield stood at 6.87%. 15-year yield stood at 7.17%. 30-year yield stood at 7.53%. Moving to Treasury bill yield and auction cutoff. 91-day Treasury bill stood at 5.30%. 182-day Treasury bill stood at 5.55%. 364-day Treasury bill stood at 5.91%. Now, the liquidity indicators. Net liquidity injected stood at negative 1,61,636 crore rupees. Standing deposit facility stood at 1,95,453 crore rupees. Marginal standing facility stood at 5,597 crore rupees. Moving to MIBOR OIS rates. 1 year stood at 5.90%. 2 years stood at 6.05%. 3 years stood at 6.16%. 5 years stood at 6.31%. Modified MIFOR rates were as follows. 2 years stood at 6.68%. 3 years stood at 6.68%. 4 years stood at 0.00%. 5 years stood at 6.90%. Turning to currency rates. The US dollar stood at 94 rupees and 57 paise against the Indian rupee, compared with 94 rupees and 69 paise previously. The euro stood at 109 rupees and 67 paise, compared with 109 rupees and 97 paise previously. The British pound stood at 126 rupees and 82 paise, compared with 127 rupees and 15 paise previously. The Japanese yen stood at 0 rupees and 59 paise, unchanged from the previous session. The Chinese yuan stood at 14 rupees, unchanged from the previous session. Now, commodities and market indices. 24-karat gold, purity 99.9%, stood at 15,137 rupees per 10 grams, compared with 15,153 rupees previously. Silver stood at 2,650 rupees per 10 grams, unchanged from the previous session. Crude oil stood at $80.08 per barrel, compared with $83.08 previously. The Sensex closed at 76,808.48, compared with 76,264.33 previously. The Nifty closed at 23,989.15, compared with 23,853.90 previously. Finally, India primary issuance in corporate bonds. Kotak Mahindra Prime Limited raised 450 crore rupees for a tenure of 38 months at a coupon of 7.97%. The issue was rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and AAA by ICRA Limited. Sundaram Finance Limited raised 1,260 crore rupees for a tenure of 38 months at a coupon of 7.95%. The issue was rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and AAA by ICRA Limited. L&T Finance Limited raised 1,500 crore rupees for a tenure of 36 months at a coupon of 8.12%. The issue was rated AAA by CARE Ratings Limited and AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited. Navi Finserv Limited raised 260 crore rupees across multiple tranches with tenures ranging from 21 to 38 months, carrying coupons ranging from 10.30% to 10.75%. The issue was rated A by CRISIL Ratings Limited. LIC Housing Finance Limited raised 1,150 crore rupees for a tenure of 59 months at a coupon of 7.59%. The issue was rated AAA by CARE Ratings Limited and AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited. National Bank for Financing Infrastructure and Development raised 5,000 crore rupees across multiple tranches with tenures ranging from 37 to 120 months, carrying coupons ranging from 7.37% to 7.66%. The issue was rated AAA by CRISIL Ratings Limited and AAA by ICRA Limited. Muffin Green Finance Limited raised 19 crore rupees for a tenure of 36 months at a coupon of 11.70%. The issue was rated A- by Acquite Ratings and Research Limited. Muthoot Mercantile Limited raised 131 crore rupees across multiple tranches with tenures ranging from 13 to 72 months, carrying coupons ranging from 0.00% to 11.00%. The issue was rated BBB+ by CRISIL Ratings Limited. That concludes today's DebtCircle Sundown brief for the 16th of June 2026. Thank you for watching. Have a great evening.